Hi, it's Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show. I'm your host, and for nearly 2 decades now, I've been an executive coach and leadership development consultant. And on this show, I share evidence-based insights from my coaching, leadership, and psychological expertise, and inspiring interviews that help women like you to combine your work, life, and motherhood in a more successful and sustainable way. Join me and my special guests as we delve into leadership and lifestyle topics for women, empowering you to thrive one conversation at a time. I'm so happy that you're here, and let's get on with today's episode. Do you ever feel stressed? Silly question, I know, because every working mother who I speak to who has ambitions in a career and wants to show up fully at home feels stressed. It's almost the water we swim in, so constant and ingrained that it seems unavoidable. But what if there was a way to understand this stress more deeply, to know its roots and manage it in a healthier and more supportive way? Well, in today's episode, we're diving into the science and realities of maternal stress with Dr. Molly Dickens, a stress physiologist, a women's health advocate, and the founder of the Maternal Stress Project. Molly's work explores the cultural, structural, and physiological pressures that shape modern motherhood, especially for those of us balancing demanding careers and family life. She's here to share powerful insights on how stress impacts us as working mothers, and most importantly, what we can do to better support ourselves in navigating it. With a background in cutting-edge research and a deep commitment to advancing women's health, Molly is a visiting researcher at the University of California, a research advisor to the Poppy Seed Health, and the founder of the Maternal Stress Project. This initiative is focused on identifying and mapping the stresses that shape modern motherhood, particularly in America, and providing essential insights for parents, healthcare providers, and workplaces alike. Molly has shared her expertise with audiences through powerful pieces in CNN, Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the New York Times. And in today's episode, we'll explore her invaluable research on maternal stress, its impact on working mothers, and what we can all do to better support the well-being of mothers navigating both careers and families. So if you've ever felt that familiar weight of stress or wondered if there's a way to lighten the load, you're in the right place. Let's explore a new understanding of maternal stress and learn some practical strategies for a healthier life. So welcome, Molly. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast show. It's really great to have you here, particularly so early because you're dialing in from California. So welcome.
Thank you for having me, Nikki. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you for joining me so early, as I say, because I think it's 6 a.m. your time over in California. So I do really, really appreciate it. So I would love for you to introduce yourself to my audience. Can you take us on a bit of a journey as to how you've come to do the work that you do, specializing in stress, but also maternal stress specifically?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of sort of a convoluted career path to get to this, I guess, thesis. I don't know how I should describe what I'm currently working on. My research background is in stress physiology. So I have my PhD in stress physiology. I followed that path for a while, planning to be an academic researcher for my career. And then, PhD, 2 postdocs, years in research later, I actually was back in California. I jumped off the academic track to join a friend's maternal health startup in these very early stages. I had just had my first baby. I was fascinated by pregnancy physiology and dismayed by how little we know about pregnancy physiology. And being in the maternal health space, it also, especially on the side of tech and innovation and that whole, it was, 2020, gosh, when was that? It would have been 2014, 2015 when I started. And really understanding where data gaps existed and how that impacted innovation and funding and clinical care and all of these things, it just, one, woke me up to how we see gaps in women's health and women's health research and how it affects women. that then kind of transitioned. I was there for 6 years. And part of my feeling around why we have these enormous gaps is we lose the women along the way, the women who are doing the research, the women who would be the entrepreneurs, who would be the innovators, who would be the funders. And we're losing these women because motherhood is a key barrier to how we ascend in our careers, for various reasons. And a lot of them come down to societal reasons.
Yeah.
And so at the time, this was in early 2020, right before COVID. So another great time on that one. I co-founded a nonprofit that was focused on gender-related, motherhood-related barriers to gender equity. And a lot of this was looking at how is childcare an issue? How is leave an issue? How is workplace culture an issue? How is just valuing women as contributors in the workplace a problem? And building and growing that organization, especially during COVID, when it was, one of probably the biggest setbacks for working mothers in our timeline, in our history for us as mothers. And that really did was a lot of people came together, and it allowed for this incredible network for those of us who were saying, okay, well, the curtain is lifted, all of the things that were holding us up, it was already made of balsa wood and flimsy as heck. And the curtain lifted and now it's on fire. So what does it look like to rebuild this world the way we want it to look? And so there was just this really collaborative energy and networking that was really rich for me in terms of learning from people who have deep experience in the space of working motherhood and gender equity and everything along those lines. And so when I was transitioning out of the nonprofit and kind of handing over the reins, I kept coming back to my roots in stress and thinking that how all of this is just it's so interconnected. It comes back not only to research gaps in women's health, but just health, our health now. And how can we see how all of this is connected? How can we see not only the health risks associated with being a parent, being a woman, being a mother, being a working mother, being a family caregiver, all the things that are gendered in many ways? How do we see the health risk of that, but also the opportunities to decrease that risk and have these conversations about all of these issues that we're facing that are often, rightly painted as gender equity issues and economic issues and equality issues. They're also health issues. And it just opens these opportunities for having different ways of improving our health as individuals, but all the way up to a public health level, to be honest. And so, the Maternal Stress Project really started from this big thought experiment of, can we look across the lifespan of being a woman, being a parent, being in a birthing body and a cycling body? Can we look at where the stressors align with these we also have extreme physiological changes in our body as women. And that also happens to align with stressors. So pregnancy and postpartum aligns with stressors, perimenopause, menopause align with stressors. And that also sets us up for additional health risk. And so Maternal Stress Project is really starting from this mapping stage, but then coming back to that, we have huge gaps in women's health. We have huge gaps in all things related to women and mothers, honestly, on the research side. And so how can we pull together what we know and the evidence that we do have and build this scaffold for how we can think about this now, even as the data and the evidence and the research kind of fills in and builds the meat around the scaffold. Meat's probably another meat on the bones, wood on the scaffold, whatever analogy I should be using right now. But I think you get where I'm going with this, Nikki.
Absolutely. And I'm just fascinated by the work you do, because there's so many things that you've said that I'm like, oh, I want to dive into that. Oh, I want to dive into that. So I know we're going to be going so many different directions. And even before we hit record, we were like, how are we going to pack this all into the time that we've got? So we will absolutely do that our best. But I'm curious as to what led you down the stress route in the first place, because You talked about you kind of studied in stress physiology. Can you explain what that actually means and why was your curiosity led in that way in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my 22-year-old self, the thing that I wanted to do in grad school, I was already really fascinated by physiology. I was fascinated by endocrinology. I knew I wanted to do research. I also wanted to be a field biologist. So I was like, how do I go into the field and study physiology? Like, is there a way to merge this? And so I got really into conservation and conservation physiology. And stress was this key thing that kept coming up, especially in terms of reproduction. So conservation, it's this thing that we talk about all the time, and how stress affects fertility. And stress affects fertility on the conservation side. That's important. On the human side, that's important. And whenever it was like, how does stress affect fertility? Everyone's like, it just does. There was like no research on the conservation side, and there was no research on the human side either, even though I feel like anybody who has gone through fertility challenges has been told that stress affects fertility.
Yeah.
And right. And we don't really know how. And I'm a how kid. So that's why I like physiology. I want to know, okay, how does that work? What are the mechanisms of that? And the other thing with stress that I just think is really cool, and why it just kind of sticks in my brain, is that it's really the way that our body responds to challenges in our environment. How we think about stress on this very basic science level. It's a really what we would call as biologists, it's a well-conserved system, which means the way that we respond to an acute challenge, a single challenge, if, our ancestor on the savannah getting chased by a lion, the way that our brain and our body responds to that challenge is the same that the bird outside your window responds to you spooking it. It's the same physiological response. And so that to me was very fascinating, how we can have this one physiological system that connects to everything else in the body, because it has this kind of important job to do, which is we need to survive right now. We need to survive right now. And so it's sending the signal, we need to survive. And then once we survive this quick challenge where we run away, it's that fight or flight response, we need to survive the survival, which means we're going to create a huge mess in our body by just getting up and running away. So we also need to clean it up and come back. And it just, again, as a physiologist, we always think in terms of homeostasis, which is our body's in balance. If we are cold, we get goosebumps, or if we, insulin and glucagon, we have all ups and downs for everything in our body. And stress is the same. It's just this more extreme push. So it just sends an alarm bell across our body, and then it cleans up the mess. But with humans, and the reason that I find it fascinating to even translate what happens in wild animals to what happens in humans, is that humans have just use it poorly.
Yeah. Yes.
We abuse this beautiful system. I mean, stress, the beautiful system. And we don't have lions anymore in the same sense. But our body, I call them modern lions. We still see modern lions in our environment. We still think there's something in the bush that's going to eat our child. We still respond the same way. And that's what gets us in trouble, because our body was not meant to have this response over and over and over and over and over again. It was not built for that. It was built for a one-time clean up the mess, move on. Maybe you'll get it again next week. And now we're getting it all the time. It's not shutting off. Human psychology has just mucked up, again, this beautiful physiology. And that's what gets us in trouble. It's when it kind of turns that corner into a chronic stress, is when you start to see these health effects, because again, it's affected everything in the body. And so all the things that it's pushed, it can push too far. So fertility, cardiovascular issues, autoimmune disease. I mean, a lot of things are exacerbated by stress, or even triggered sometimes. So
brilliant. And again, it's so fascinating. So where my head's gone to is, we've talked about stress there, and we've talked about stressors, and I wonder if you could just kind of almost define those for us, because they're going to be so important to, I suppose, frame the conversation we're going to have. So how do we, because stress is such an overused word, I think now it's almost synonymous with modern life. So what actually is stress? Is all stress bad? And what's the difference between stress and stressor? Like, give us some context if that's okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, stress is a word, as you point out, like it means everything and nothing. It's just used in a colloquial way where, what do we do with that? Are you stressed? Yeah. What do I do with that information? And so, yes, when I talk about it, I tend to try to talk about stressors, stress response, acute stress, chronic stress, terms like that. And stressor, bear with me because even stress researchers have this kind of circular definition. A stressor is something that causes a stress response, that physical stress response. And a stress response is a physical response to a stressor. So it's circular. But I think the important thing that is the way that we should think about stressor, I often tack on the word potential stressor, because a stressor implies that we are responding to it. We can have challenges in our environment that we don't respond to. But once we perceive them as a stressor, once our brain kind of flicks on that moment that says, okay, this is something to pay attention to, this is something to respond to, that's when it becomes a stressor. And that's the important thing, especially when we think about maternal stress or human stress. This is where human psychology kind of comes in and mucks up everything, because we have that perception layer, and that perception, it comes back to who we are as individuals, our personality, our circumstances, our situation at the time, other challenges that we're facing. And that's why, with the maternal stressor map, one of the things that I talk about with stressors on this map is that they're very interconnected, because each of them can essentially exacerbate or worsen or even reduce how we're perceiving the challenges that are external to us. So we can have everything in the world piling on around us, but unless we are perceiving them as stressors, they're not going to have that physical response. We just have a tendency to respond to them.
And it reminds me, Molly, I trained in cognitive behavioral approach many years ago, and it was almost the analogy they would use is, you see a lion. If you saw it in a zoo, you might go, oh, that's a beautiful animal and I want to book a safari. But if you saw it kind of in your bedroom as you wake up, you'd have a different response.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite, I have this, and one of the posts that I wrote were just kind of explaining what stress is on my Substack. I have like a GIF of a kid pressed up against the lion cage at the zoo, and the lion's like pawing at the glass. And it's this feeling of, there's a mom videoing this and she's fine. She's not responding to that. But like, that is, our ancient brain should think that this is a problem, and we don't. And so even in that analogy, like, lions are not lions today. They're in a zoo. So it's exactly that.
So you mentioned about the stressor map. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what that means, and what your research has kind of shown, particularly kind of in the maternal space?
Yeah. So where I started with the Maternal Stress Project was really from this visual. How can we get eyes on any potential stressor that we might encounter as parents, as women, as people in a birthing, cycling body, as caregivers? Where are these stressors kind of congregating is not the right word, but where are they clustering? Where are they affecting us throughout a lifespan? And then how are they connected? And so what it started with was, the stressor map, it has a timeline. It has we consider the reproductive lifespan. So starting kind of post-adolescence, going through pregnancy and postpartum. Because again, the other part of this, because I'm a physiology nerd, is that we have these incredible dynamic physiological changes that happen in our lives, and they're natural and they're normal and they're beautiful, but they put us more at risk for everything. So, having that on the map is already kind of acknowledging our body is changing at certain points. And then there's stressors that align wherever on this map. And so there's things on there, like I feel like I should have the map in front of me so I can go through it. But, everything from just the pregnancy experience, something like birth trauma, breastfeeding and feeding decisions. There's other mental load and other elements of invisible domestic load in the home. Sleep is a very circular stressor. Child safety, child health. There's elements and they come up at different times. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, some of them are across the lifespan. But then they also communicate to each other because, again, they're all connected. So another thing on there is financial stability and workplace issues. And that has a close connection, but that also has a close connection to breastfeeding and feeding decisions, and to sleep, and to mental load, and to childcare, and to all of these things that are on there, and just understanding that interconnected nature in this visual form so that we can then kind of go piece by piece. So far I've kind of started going piece by piece. I did a deep dive into breastfeeding and feeding decisions. I've done a deep dive into childcare issues. I've done a deep dive into abortion access. That's a big topic for us in the US.
Of course, yes.
Unfortunately. And I think the way that I have it with the map and with these deep dives is that it allows for us to look for other solutions to decrease that stress that don't rely on individual responsibility to solve it. So even something with breastfeeding and feeding decisions, it's connected to identity, and that's connected to social narrative. And so how are we communicating, and shaming breastfeeding and feeding decisions? How are we showing up for other people in this space? How are we making sure our workplaces are set up for the transition back to work? Because that, in connection to breastfeeding and feeding decisions and identity and social narrative, that's a big stressor connection. And, and sleep. And I think even with something like sleep, that connection it's not a sleep more, it's a, we need to see how this is affecting our health. And so how do we have different conversations with our partner or find additional night help if we're able to protect that part and make sure that we can reduce that as a stressor because of how interconnected it is. So it's a visual, but it's also the starting point for how do we, really go deep into where are the solutions that we can decrease the pressure going into the stressor and going out of that stressor.
Yeah. And I love that. And as you were talking, and I could picture the map kind of in my own head, and I could also kind of go tick, 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 tick. Because one of the things you may not know about my journey is what led me to do the work that I do and kind of run this podcast is a year after having my first child, who's now 11, I seriously burnt myself out, and it blindsided me. I was like, how did that happen? I literally burnt my adrenaline system out, and it took me about 2 years to recover. And my journey has been piecing together what I'm now imagining is your stress amount, kind of going, oh, that's why.
That's what it was.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of the map is that it allows for people to see themselves in it. There's stressors on the map that many women will never encounter, ever, never have it as an issue. And there's some that, here's my 5 and here's how they're connected. And I think the other thing is that, there's going to be certain things, even if you look at it from an individual perspective, there's going to be certain things where you're like, there's nothing I can do about this one. There's like literally nothing I can do about this one. My mother-in-law is going to shame me for not breastfeeding forever. So like, I'm not going to be able to change that, whatever it might be. But where you see it's connected to something else, stress, again, it's chronic stress. It's cumulative. Think of it as a pile of rocks, and there's going to be big boulders and there's going to be tiny pebbles, and lifting any weight is good. That's positive. And so it's this freedom to kind of chip away where you can, instead of shrugging your shoulders and saying, oh, well, I'm swimming in it. I'm swimming in the stress. We absolutely are. And so to be able to see, okay, but we can take some of these pebbles off, or we can, more importantly, pass some of these pebbles.
Yeah.
I want it to not be an individual problem with an individual solution.
And I love that, because one of the things that I found in my kind of recovery journey was the initial shame that I felt in not being good enough, not being strong enough. And somehow if I'd eaten and have had a cardio or done enough yoga or whatever it might be, I should have been able to do this, because every other woman was kind of managing it. And being kind of validating that, no, this is the water we swim in, whether we know it or not. Some of us have more privilege than other in that we might have access to more resources that help us to swim a little bit easier. But yeah, there's kind of the society piece is massive.
And we're all individuals. And so that comes back to that perception filter.
Yeah.
Just because someone else is not responding to a challenge the way that you do doesn't mean that you're wrong in how you respond. We're just different people. There's different things that are going, that our brain is pinging around, that's deciding whether or not things are stressors. And so you can't fault yourself for not responding the way someone else does. And that's honestly why I really try to get away from, or encourage getting away from even the view of resilience and coping mechanisms and things like that. Because again, it's putting that individual, it's framing this as an individual problem with individual solutions. And there's nothing that causes stress more than failure. And so we're just in this loop of like, well, I should, exactly as you identified, like you get into this spiral of, well, I should be able to rest and recuperate, and I should be able to bounce back. I mean, resilience is also described as bouncing back, which I feel like is a triggering phrase for postpartum people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
A term used for resilience. And you're like, that is certain people, fine. Not everyone. And so we can't expect it from everyone. And then when we expect it from everyone and everyone feels like it's something they should be able to do, then you're just adding another stressor onto the pile, because you're setting them up for failure and the feelings of failure.
Thank you for that. And I hope everybody listening, I know that my nervous system has just gone, oh, thank you. That's kind of a message we need reinforcing. And I'm wondering what your research may have kind of indicate about how the modern motherhood stresses have evolved, how that might be to perhaps where our mothers or our grandmothers. What can you share with us about kind of modern motherhood and what your research indicates?
Yeah, I mean, I think modern motherhood, a lot of it, I get a lot of my information too from even just talking to people, and as you do, and you probably can name a number of modern motherhood stressors. I think we're parenting in a time where I have an almost 11-year-old, so we're about the same place in our journey of motherhood, and I feel like we came up in the age of attachment parenting and parenting experts and access to parenting experts in a different kind of way, where it's not just a parenting expert that has a book that everyone reads, but we also have social media, and we have experts who probably aren't really experts, but have a platform. And we have access to watching other people succeed in a public performative way, but then we judge ourselves against it. So we have different elements related to mom guilt and shame and identity that are just fueled by our access to seeing other people's lives presented in, again, a performative way. We have this training of, how should we be engaging, interacting, spending time with our children, that I feel like is different than our parents. I mean, I'm an 80s kid. I feel like we are always like, we would just run around outside, and like culture, not only parenting, but I think culture has changed in that you see a 10-year-old running loose down the street and everyone's worried about that kid. Whereas in the 80s, it was like, cool, there's why there should be 5-year-olds running around by themselves. And so then we have this, intensive parenting moment. And I feel like intensive parenting has become very buzzy. Especially, I'm sure, I don't know if you see this in the UK, I'm sure it's made, international news, but the US Surgeon General released an advisory on parenting stress and parenting mental health and how it was a health hazard and a public health hazard. And a lot of what came out of that was this lens on intensive parenting, which I do agree with to some degree, but I also, that shouldn't have been the only takeaway.
Yes.
And so, yes, we can look to intensive parenting as this is a modern mom problem. I think we also, as we are really recognizing our place in the workforce, contributing where we want to be, it's not being matched by what we need in terms of structural support. So in the US, we still don't have a federal paid leave policy, which is insane. We have little to no support for childcare. And so our childcare expenses, one, we have a childcare crisis. So it's hard to even get childcare now compared to even when I was looking for childcare 11 years ago, right? And it's incredibly expensive. And so we don't have, as we're taking our place in the working world, we don't have the social structure to alleviate the pressure on finding that balance. Our school day is short. It's not a full work day. So there's a lot of, I think that is part of the modern stressors is that, it's not that we have more per se. I think they're just more intense for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, no, and I love how you've explained that, because I think that is the almost perfect storm that we're caught in.
Absolutely.
That, when you look at the research that I've looked at, you go, well, actually, we have more rights than we had 50 years ago. We now have like a washing machine, a dishwasher, all the things that we wouldn't have had perhaps 50 years ago. Yet all of the well-being data says, and we're still not benefiting from that because of all the things you've mentioned.
And I think, I don't have the research on this, but where my brain goes to right now is, and where research I feel like is starting to show, is that the physical tasks, the washing the laundry, the making the food, the physical tasks associated with parenting, I don't think that's where the stress comes in. So having the washing machine evolve over the years so that we can do a load and not worry about it, not like hand wring it, I don't think that's alleviating the stress. I think the stress of modern parenting is coming from, we sent our kid to school with a lunchbox full of snacks because we didn't have time to make a sandwich. And now we're being shamed as mothers. And so I think the stress is more actually related to the emotional elements of the labor rather than the labor itself. And so having tools that just reduces the labor, I don't know if that's going to impact stress as much as we think it might. And as you point out, we have all these things that make our life easier. And it's a podcast, so you can't see I'm doing air quotes. We have all these things that make our life easier theoretically, but it's not fixing anything. And we're still burning out and and I think it's because we haven't solved for, or we're actually in many ways made worse, the emotional side.
Yeah, I get that. And what came into my head as you were saying that, Molly, is there's been many an occasion where I run my business from home. So I always think I've got, and I like that, I like that I get, a significant amount of time at home that enables me to put the washing on while I'm doing my work during the day. But the amount of shame I felt that on a busy day, I've not had the time to peg it on the washing line outside. My neighbour has, but I haven't. And I've ended up putting it into the tumble dryer, which now I'm contributing to the environment problem because I'm using electricity. And now I'm this bad person because I'm working from home. I haven't even got my washing on the line and I've had this negative impact on the environment. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot to carry.
Yeah. And then it's like, well, what does my neighbor think of me?
Yeah.
Because clearly I haven't had washing out. And
Yeah.
but then why is it you? Why isn't it your partner? Why isn't it your child? Why is the assumption, if washing's not on the line, that it's the mother in the house
Yes.
that failed the task? And that's how we feel.
Yeah, I did a post recently that's gone a bit viral on LinkedIn about there's an actress in the UK that just put on her social media that she has a cleaner, and she was shamed for it. And I was like, this just makes my blood boil, because it's this paradox of, we expect women to have it all, do it all, but if they admit to the help that they get to be able to have and do it all, it's somehow they're less of a woman. And it's gone viral because people are like, this is insane, and it is. There's that kind of that emotional tone to it. It's just like, well, why shouldn't she? And it's like, well, her male partner wouldn't be shamed if he had admitted that he had a cleaner. What is that? What is that about?
Yeah. And there was a post that I saw. It was on Substack that I had restacked, and it was about this just calling out how when households cut back, when they look at their financials and they cut back on the budget and they say, we can't go out to eat anymore, we can't have the cleaning person, we can't do this, we can't do that. Most of the things that they cut back on are areas that it's expected the mother will fill in the gaps
Oh,
if they're not getting the help.
interesting.
And so that in and of itself, even those household financial conversations become gendered and add more weight back onto the mother. And I think that, again, that's part of changing how we look at these things and we talk about these things. And yeah, it's rich. I mean, someone who can afford a cleaning, I have a cleaning person.
I do. Yeah.
So that's crazy to me.
But for years, I was a little bit like, oh, I don't know if to admit this, because does it make me less of a woman? Because actually, if I was an amazing woman, I would be this domestic goddess that could do it all. And it's like, what is that about? Like that, talk about like just swallowing those society kind of expectations. So what I would love to hear from you now, and you've all already kind of indicated about this, about the kind of the boulders and the rocks, about if anybody's listening going, oh gosh, I can feel that map. I'm living it. I can feel the weight of it. I'm carrying all those boulders and all those rocks. And I absolutely hear you when you talked about this isn't about resilience and about, well, let's just make you kind of more capable at kind of holding it all. What has your research kind of shown about what we can do then? And also I'd love to hear in that what impact that's had on you personally, what you've done or what you do that really helps you with this.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, I keep coming back to this, but I really want to continue painting this as not an individual problem and not relying on individual solutions. That's not to say there are great stress management tools. There's deep breathing in a moment is, certain types of breathing, methods of breathing, great. Meditation, mindfulness, great. Like exercise, great. Getting in nature, great. There's ways of managing stress. That has been discussed. You can find lists of stress management tools everywhere you look. And so I don't need to do that. And I think, what I like to focus on is looking at, if we had, we're at the middle, but expanding concentric circles around where should we look to support? Where should we look to stress reduction? And, maybe starting with partner, family, community, workplace, and a public, a public level and a policy level. And I think, obviously that big policy level, I don't expect you to go do all the work to make big policy changes. That's a bigger conversation for people in that space. But I think even starting at the smaller levels, the partner level, family level, the hired help level. Too, if you're able to afford it, and look at where are the stressors that I'm experiencing? Where can I relieve the pressure? And I think part of it also comes back to like, how do I feel in these moments? For example, we talked about social media. Like, I think if a lot of that guilt and shame and comparison is coming from who you're following on Instagram. Start there. Like
Yes.
that, because that can just lodge itself in your brain. And anything you do, any of these tasks that you do that make you feel, I'm not good enough, I'm not doing enough, I'm not a woman enough, I'm not mother enough, I'm all the things. If that is coming from comparison, shut off that comparison. Just shut off the link to that stressor. And I've been trying to get better at that. And I've been trying, because I know that's a big source for me, is that comparison. And so I've been trying to shut that off. And then, there's aspects of in the home. So like mental load is fascinating to me as a potential stressor. And again, I think, with mental load, it's divided between cognitive and emotional labor. And I think as women, as mothers, we tend to take on both the emotional labor. I don't think it's biological, but I think it's related to how we are the ones who take on a primary caregiver role right out of the gate. And so our brains just adapt to that, and our partner's brain adapts to not being a primary caregiver. And so I think that's a whole other topic for another hour of podcast. We don't need to go there. But I think our brains have shifted in this primary caregiver role. And it relates to all primary caregivers, not just mothers, not just birth mothers. But I think we are primed to take on a bulk of emotional labor. And so I think that also needs to open the conversation for how we divide mental load in the home, because that is very gendered and that is very societally gendered. And women, this is, I think this is a place to start in terms of how we have the conversation. This is affecting my health. I have too many balls up in the air. I'm waking up with my, at 5 a.m. with my list of things I have to do during the day. And half of that is related to a child that we share, that we co-parent. And you know what? You need to do all doctor's appointments from now on, or you need to do all sports from now on, or you need to do the birthday party. And also recognizing what fuels you and what takes away. And I think that's another practice that I'm trying to get into in my house is I already told you, I have a cleaning person. I don't like to clean. My husband likes to clean. If he wants a clean house, he can clean it, or we can get a cleaning person, because that doesn't fuel me. That adds to my weight, and I don't want to do it. So, and I don't feel shame. I've gotten over feeling shame about it, because I've just closed the door.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And then, other things like, I know that I am stressed with birthday party planning. And so my husband for the last 2 years has been in charge of my older daughter, has a big sleepover every year with like all her friends. And I leave the house and he is in charge. And he's the one sending out the invitations. I mean, the moms think it's amazing. Like, I think this is the other thing. We need to change the culture. So all of the birthday information is coming from him, to the other two moms, because we haven't shifted it enough that it's only dads who are in charge of these things. But he's completely in charge of it, and I'm not even going to be home. I have nothing to do with this birthday party whatsoever.
I love that, Molly.
It's like, how do you pass these things off? And we can pass them off, and it doesn't matter who is, the primary caregiver, the secondary, it doesn't matter who is working for more pay or less pay or no pay. It doesn't matter. It's the load. The load needs to be redistributed, because that is also part of this stressor map, and it's part of what's affecting our health.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. And I love that example of how you're bringing that alive in your kind of own home. So you've talked about obviously these bigger systemic pieces, and you quite rightly said kind of from a kind of public policy perspective that might be kind of out of our direct control and direct influence. But you've talked about there the workplace and how much that has an impact on our kind of stressors. What have you found through your research is where we need to be having the conversations? What can we be doing in that space?
Well, I think it's on both sides, the employer and the employee, and where, I think it differs depending on what kind of workplace you have and what kind of structure you're in, and whether or not you're in a position of power or in a position of advocacy, and working from the level where you are, right? And starting there. And I think, if I had a magic wand that I could wave and like fix every workplace, it would really start with a big culture shift and just valuing women's work, valuing our time, valuing humans as humans, and understanding that, there are elements of workplace culture, there are elements of workplace structure, flexibility, hours, leave programs, all these, there are different elements of it that can affect health. And on the employer side, I mean, it's good to have healthy employees, right? Like, you want to have healthy employees. They're more effective, they're more efficient, they show up to work more, all of these things. And it has that element of it's not a big ask. For example, the transition back to work, I think, is a key example. The body, the brain, they're still changing. You're still recovering from postpartum. There's all different elements of shame and guilt associated with return to work. And when you return, full on, when you don't have that support, when you're not acknowledged as a human, when you come back and you are trying to continue breastfeeding and you're pumping and there's no pumping room, there's these elements of stress that don't have to be there. Like, just set up the pumping room. Just set up the pumping room. Why should I have to advocate for my own pumping room? It's just an added stress on my plate. And, I think that starting from that, childcare is a whole other thing, and understanding what it means to, have just, again, be human. You have a child. The school doesn't fit work hours, but also kids get sick and things come up, and we have conferences and meetings with, we have to get them to sport or whatever it may be. How do we just change the workplace culture to see the humans and also respect the health elements of fighting against the human nature of our human workers?
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that. I'm like, we're singing from the same hymn sheet. There's so much we've covered, and I wondered if there was just one message that you would want somebody listening to this conversation to take away from all of your research. I know we've only just scratched the surface, and I'm like, we could, there's so many areas that we could dive deeper on, I'm sure. But what would you want that kind of one message to be?
I think it comes back to your example, and I feel like I'm just talking to you, Nikki. It's like, be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself. We are absolutely swimming in this sea of stressors, and it's going to take us down at some point. It can, it might, it will, or it won't. And if it does, just be kind to yourself. It's not your fault. It's not your responsibility. It's not your responsibility. Like, there is a way that we need to just see that this is not again, I keep echoing this, it's not an individual problem. It's not your individual responsibility to pull yourself out of it. So just be kind to yourself.
Oh, I love that. I think I need that kind of imprinted on my forehead, because a lot of my audience are high achieving women that, like, we hold ourselves to such high standards, and we have strong personal power. So we're like, if I just push hard enough, if I just get more organized, and it's that, no, actually, there's the stuff here that it doesn't matter how determined, how dedicated, how strong you are, it can still take you under. And I love that. It's be kind and know that a lot of this stuff is not our fault. So what's the future for your research? I'm intrigued as to where you're going to go next with this, because there are so many kind of, areas that you could go. So what are you exploring next with your work?
Yeah. So I am, I think where I kind of started with it was can we have this base layer of this map that we can then make almost three-dimensional? So we can layer on different things. So whether it's working with policymakers, I don't want to get into this too much, but maybe at a federal policy level, things have changed or doors have closed for a little while over here in the US, but we still have local things that we can look at. And so how do we see big, broad changes at like a policy level through this lens to say, okay, if we did this, it would relieve the pressure off these stressors. And then, a similar thing again for even workplaces. It's if we were to layer on what we are able to do in a workplace, if we were able to offer a better paid leave policy, if we were able to offer childcare benefits, if we were able to offer a special transition back to work support or coaching, what does that look like? How does that relieve the pressure off of the stressors that people are encountering during this phase of life? And then similarly with an individual, I would love to get this map once it's more established in terms of how everything is connected, to that. How do we play with it as individuals? How do we look at where we are feeling the most pressure, where we are feeling the most challenges, and start to kind of see where are the resources to relieve this stress off of these specific stressors, where we can make change. And so I'm working towards getting this to a more sort of interactive and application.
Love it.
Slide. And so for now, I'm still in this evidence building, testing, hypothesis, that testing stage. And the next phase is really going to be that application of this.
Oh, that sounds incredible. And just thank you for the work that you do, because it's so important, as you say, and so unexamined up until kind of the work you're doing. So thank you for that. And I know people are going to want to find out more about you. Where would you point them to? I've heard you mention Substack, but where else can people find you? And I can put all the links into the show notes, so I can drop those in for people.
Yeah, so I'm currently kind of writing and exploring this on Substack. The easiest way to find it is that there's a button that will take you to the Substack. If you just go to maternalstressproject.org, you'll get a button up top and you can get right to the Substack. And then I am on Instagram. Like I said, social media is a little bit of a stressor for me. So you'll see that I'm not I'm not a prolific poster over there, but it's at least a holding place for each individual posts and individual topics that I cover. And that's Maternal Stress. I believe it's just Maternal Stress Project at Maternal Stress Project for Instagram. And I'll give you that link as well. And yeah, that's primarily where I am these days.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me so early in the morning and for sharing your expertise, your experience, because I know it's resonated deeply for me and I know it will with people listening too. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. This is really fun.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.